next guest on the show now is Matt Kilcoyne, the Deputy Director of the Adam Smith Institute, who's with me now. Matt, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Good evening, Mike.
Yeah, well, good evening to yourself indeed as well. Rishi Sunak is in charge of the Exchequer. We've run up huge bills, anything between 300 and 400 billion. You, of course, are of the view, and I think you'll clarify that for me in just 1 second, that tax rises ain't going to do us any good right now. But if not, how do we pay the money back?
So we obviously thought that when the pandemic was happening, that the Chancellor was absolutely right to get out the national credit card in order to reduce the amount of economic activity and therefore reduce the number of human interactions and so stop the spread of this virus.
Yes.
However, going into the budget period saying, whilst restrictions are still in place, whilst the economy is still shut, whilst businesses are not able to raise revenue, saying that all of these businesses are going to have to pay higher tax is just a signal to not invest in the UK. It is a symbol to say that the UK is closed for business at a time when it should be looking at ways to reopen the economy.
Yeah, but again, I asked you, how are we going to pay off the bill? How are we going to pay off the bill, man? I mean, what are we going to do? Just going to park it and say, right, put that in a different account and we'll kick that into the long grass and have a look at that in a couple of years' time? I mean, often economists say go for growth, and growth then means that the bill gets smaller. Can that possibly happen?
Yeah, so there are different ways. Like everyone pays different bills, right? If you buy a frock in a shop, you have to pay straight up front in cash. If you're buying on credit terms, you can spread it out over a few months. And if you're buying a house, you'll be on a 25-year mortgage or similar. Now, the government has the same thing with bonds. Some things are paid up front, some things are paid off over long periods of time. And the UK has a really long history of paying its debts, paying its way. And so it's rewarded in the international money markets by having lower gilt yields and also longer durations of debt, which allow the government to make this kind of large-scale borrowing in once-in-a-generation's disaster scenarios.
Yeah, OK. Well, a lot of technical information there, but can I just say this, Matt? There's one headline I've got here. Sunak tax plan would lead to entrepreneurs fleeing Britain. And that comes from Tim Steiner, Chief Executive of Ocado. But isn't the fact, Matt, that the whole of the world is in the same position as we are? America's debt proportionately is much bigger than ours. The European countries have racked up massive debt, and theirs are going to be worse, possibly, because they're not going to have the vaccination programme finished as quickly as we are. It's all very well saying entrepreneurs will flee Britain, but where will they go? Is there anywhere to go? Aren't we all in this together?
So I think when we were looking at the pandemic, you were absolutely right. We all faced the pandemic together. That was a very sort of unique scenario in terms of natural disasters. You know, if there's a volcano in one country, it typically affects just one or a few of the airline flights. But the pandemic hit everywhere. It hasn't, the developed world and Europe, especially in the UK, especially with large numbers of deaths, because of aging populations, has seen a much worse hit in terms of the economy, and we've had to shut much more of the economy. When you say how will it go for growth, though, we actually do think that the country can grow faster than the debt pile that it has built up. This debt pile has been in a very similar way built up in mass emergency situations before, whether that was the Second World War or the First World War. You see these huge spikes in debt being built up. But we know that because you're on the winning side, because we're on the side of science and on the side of defeating this virus, that life will go back to normal, that life will be allowed to restart, that we'll be allowed to innovate, create, and build the jobs of the future. And that will create the growth that allows us to pay off the debts that we've built up for this 1 year period.
I see. Now, are you a big believer in what might be called the £250 billion explosion of spending and economic growth that might happen within months of the end of lockdown? So there could be by autumn this year, we've got an economy booming faster than it was before COVID. Do you believe that can happen? And do you believe that will bring in sufficient revenues to start attacking the mountain of debt?
So I take a bit more of a cautious note on pent-up demand, because a lot of the time when we're saying that people have built up their savings rate, We know that people like to have a cushion. People like to have a buffer. Ordinary families that are not spending the money on the commute know that they're going to have to go back to the commute, that they're going to have to get the car fixed, that they're going to have to pay the kids' uniforms, and so they're not going to go out and just spend it spend what they'd saved. They'll be spending the same amounts that they'd previously done. They'll just probably put a larger amount away in their savings accounts, their pensions and ISAs. Now that's not dead money. Every amount that's invested in a financial institution gets reinvested across. So that goes straight into pubs and into shops, into the new industries in the country, and actually very efficiently, because the UK has a very efficient financial services sector. But in terms of do I believe there'll just be an explosion of capital? Probably not. No, that's a bit of a myth that really we should walk away from.
Well, I think, for instance, if I had my way, and I'm not joking about this, the one thing I want to do when the world comes back to normal is I'm going to fly across the Atlantic in at least a business class seat, maybe even a first class seat, because that's something I've always loved doing during my life and haven't been able to do now for a year, and I've done it for about 2.5 years. But for instance, I haven't been spending money like I used to spend money because there's been nowhere to spend it. And, if I've wanted the odd drink at home, it's an awful lot cheaper buying it from a supermarket than buying it at a pub at £5 a pint. So I will be doing that, and I think millions of others will as well. One thing I want to ask you, Matt, was I think successive governments' inability to solve the crisis that we have in looking after the elderly in this country is locking up a huge amount of what I'd call the grey pound, because those people have the money. They live in big houses worth millions of pounds, which, they could turn into money. But everybody's frightened about paying for their old age, and that's something that's holding the economy back.
Probably true. We could probably start to unlock older generations, but we don't know about the evidence on transmissibility of this virus. That's still ongoing in terms of a scientific debate. And we should err on sort of the side of caution when we know that that's the age group that is most likely to be affected in serious mortality figures. But in terms of the optics as well for this kind of political move, it might sound very good to listeners who are of a certain age. But if you are a young person who has willingly sacrificed with a very low risk of getting a very serious disease, a whole year of their youth, that is going to be that's a real generational conflict that I'm not sure necessarily you want to stoke if you're a politician in the country.
OK, fine. Now, put together that headline I've just read you. Sunak tax plan would lead to entrepreneurs fleeing Britain. And something you said recently, the government has shuttered the shops. The Chancellor is threatening to put up taxes on firms that survive this bleak winter. Are we talking here about companies like Amazon? Because they've made extraordinary profits during lockdown, and some would say that that they've been very lucky. They're the right people in the right place at the right time, but they've accumulated so much wealth. There is a reason to say that a possibility of a windfall tax might be something the Chancellor might consider. And I know about, the fact that, companies can go and take their bases elsewhere. But again, I don't think there's anywhere else they can take them in the country. International companies now have to work to international rules.
So what has Amazon done to earn these huge mega profits? It's provided huge amounts of value to millions and millions of Brits. Those parcels through the door, the convenience with which you get them. It's the most incredibly lucky company in the world if it's logistics and it's just happened to happen and just the right way. No, this is the product and work of tens of thousands of Amazon employees working to create a system that means that you can get parcels delivered to your home. Now they have. There's questions about whether their revenue is booked in the right place, whether it can be whether it's paying the right level of corporate tax and so on. But we shouldn't remember that actually it's not just corporation tax that companies pay. Amazon will pay national insurance. It will pay the IPT on various things and VAT on various things. Yeah. The idea that Amazon is not paying any tax is a kind of a misnomer that's designed by sort of left-wing activists to try and say that big tech is a source of all the world's ills, rather than actually a source of many of the world's great solutions.
Oh, don't worry. I'm a big defender of successful companies. Successful companies generate profits. Those profits have to be spent somewhere. I believe in trickle-down economics, but I'm just thinking that you used the word lucky, Amazon being in the right place at the right time. And I think it wouldn't be outrageous for the Chancellor to suggest perhaps they could return a bit of that to the economy. Just looking at some of the projections about what might happen next week, Matt, the UK's debt pile hit 2.1 trillion at the end of January, almost as large as the size of the economy. So there's going to have to be an awful lot of growth to get over that. Ahead of the budget on March the 3rd, Mr Sunak is expected to look at ramping up a number of levies from capital gains tax to corporation tax and fuel duty. Now, I think it's things like fuel duty and the capital gains tax which will cause him huge problems, because that's taking money off people who have earned the money to invest and don't expect to be taxed on it, if you see what I mean. And for anybody living in the country, the idea they're going to pay more for their petrol now is absurd.
I think a lot of the sort of like the questions about which taxes are going to be raised and which ones are being floated right now, we have to have a little bit of Kremlinology in play, because what they're doing is they're floating ideas, seeing which ones get the most opposition, which ones annoy journalists such as yourself and pundits like such as myself, and then they start to see which the public respond to. And I think you're right, Mike. I think that you'd end up with a fuel duty increase, and that would look like a disaster. It would look like a hit onto the poorest, and it would irk the backbenchers of the Conservative Party, even if it does fit within their wider model of the environmental. Whether they can do that, whether they can hit capital gains, it probably is easier to do, but that it actually would be more economically damaging, because it would deter investment. It would deter inward investment into the UK and make us less competitive internationally. And that's the kind of there's trade-offs in terms of what's politically palatable, what would work, and what is actually economically damaging.
I totally agree. And also, it would completely stumify the housing market again. George Osborne did a very good job at that when he sort of started hammering buy-to-let landlords and that sort of thing. And the idea that if you sell your own house, it's going to be subject to some kind of a tax after living there, I think is a non-starter. Matt, thank you very much indeed for having joined me. Matt Kilcoyne,